Hi, sweets. I ran into a very interesting article today in which a trans woman was talking about a kind of hierarchy of castes with trans women that she encountered when she transitioned. And she called it a caste system. And, that there's a whole ranking in which the trans women on the top will not associate with the groups lower than them, and the whole ranking of this system was really based on passing. So she said at the top of the system were trans women that were considered conventionally attractive, passed as women, and had also had bottom surgery, so they had their penises turned inside out. Next down, the next group were similar, that they conventionally attractive women. Oh yeah, and also heteronormative, that they couldn't be lesbians. They also needed to be with a man. The next down were, the same, conventionally attracted to men, had a husband perhaps, but then did not have SRS, so they still had penises. And then lower down were the trans women who didn't pass as well, down to the ones that outright didn't pass, cross-dressers, and then, the lowest of the low were people who just cross-dress as a fetish. And it's really interesting because she really does see it as a caste system, in which you just didn't associate with people. You didn't ever want to be associated with someone who didn't pass. You thought that people might think you were a transsexual. Oh my God. And she brought up, she was a little coy. She brought up that to what extent this is internalized transphobia. Which is very interesting, to what extent, a lot of the culture which has arisen around transsexual women, has to do with, a phobic attitude towards being different, towards, not passing, towards standing out, and towards this combination of a male body with female personality, female emotions. It's especially with the real transsexuals that I've been talking with on my blog. And, they've had the SRS, and they really resent that trans women who have not had surgery call themselves transsexuals. And then they have all this victimization. They have this whole mythology of victimization, that the transgenders are victimizing them. Even going, to this bizarre extent that, they're copying what the radical feminists, the radical lesbians, said about them. So radical feminists are always saying, oh, we can't let trans women into our spaces because they are predators. They have penises. They may rape us. That we could never be safe with them around. And so the real transsexuals are saying the same thing about transgenders. Oh, they're really men, and they have these penises, and they're raping other women and giving us a bad name. So, it's really kind of sad, and it really kind of makes me, think. About this, going into the closet, passing as a woman, denying difference, denying that we were born as boys, and this whole thing of not saying that, never saying that you were a boy, getting really upset, playing the victim card if someone uses that terminology. And it also reminds me of part of why, when I was exploring my possible transsexuality in those lonely days last year, when I was going around as a non-passing, purposely non-passing individual, that I never really made a trans woman friend, and that I found if I would approach them, the trans women were not very friendly. They really weren't. I met Shana Virago once. She was fairly friendly. I didn't really try to get in touch with her later. So, aside from her, every trans woman I met was like, "Get away from me! Why are you talking to me?" It was really confusing because I wanted some answers, and I found most of them ran into rather mean, rather unfriendly, angry, and mean. So trans guys would extend the hand of friendship. Trans women were not nice, and I think it might have to do with this whole caste hierarchy. I feel, personally, I feel that there's a lot of self-hatred involved in that caste hierarchy, of not being what we were born, and despising how we were born, and despising people who remind us of how we were born, people like me, or the poor trans women who have no hope of passing, but still try that route. And there may have been a couple more things that I wanted to say, but perhaps that's enough. Okay, bye-bye.